This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This week I'll be moving on to talk about the ancient Romans. Ancient Rome goes back thousands of years. If you know about their history, they're very famous for the Roman Empire, which took over most of the Mediterranean world. This week I'll be focusing on talking about the early background of the Romans, how this city-state of Rome eventually went on to take over a good chunk of all of Italy, and then, of course, took over Europe, and then parts of North Africa and Asia, growing to eventually close to 2 million square miles by late antiquity. So we'll focus on talking about the background of Rome, how it started with the monarchies of Rome, like Romulus and Remus you've heard of. Romulus, of course, the first king of the Romans. So we'll talk about how Rome went through a monarchy. And then we'll talk about also the rise of the Roman Republic, one of the first of its kind in the world. And the Roman Republic was heavily influential on other civilizations, especially the West. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about also the rise of all these political dictators in Rome as well, such as Gaius Marius and Cornelius Sulla. We'll talk about also men like Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. These are, of course, famous Roman politicians, dictators that eventually make Rome into an empire. So we'll talk about that. We'll get to Julius Caesar, especially later in the lecture. Julius Caesar really is one of the individuals that they think leads to the end of the Republic. A lot of his influences in the end caused that. We'll later have, of course, his grandnephew, Octavian. Octavian, later known as Caesar Augustus, will go on to become the first Roman emperor. So between this week and next week, we'll be talking about the rise of the Romans into an empire. So know at this point in the semester, students should be working on that second exam, which of course is on ancient China and ancient Greece. I know some of the lectures I had, Alexander the Great kind of filled in, so looks like he did a really great job during that period. Some of those previews he did for those lectures. So I know that's a major assessment. The Romans, of course, will be assessed on various quizzes and exams at the end of the semester. I know the Roman Empire is usually one of the topics for the final. So that's it for now for this preview. Of course, I'll get into, the main part on the history of early Roman history, of course, this week. I'm going to first talk about some of the background about the Roman civilization. Of course, we'll kind of start with Romulus later. Romulus, of course, was the first king of the Romans, which, for a short time, the Romans were ruled by a monarchy, but they're more famous for its republic, and then later, even greater, the Roman Empire that would dominate the Mediterranean world for multiple centuries. I'll first get into like a little background about Rome. You can see here kind of an image right there. Of course, on the right in that image, you got the Roman Forum. I'll get to SPQR later. That's, about that. That's one of the names they often called the Roman government with its state that went back to ancient times. Kind of showing you a map right here. They believe that the ancient Roman state, like a long time ago, started out small, like they were talking about in that short video. It started out almost like kind of like a Greek city-state in a sense. In central Italy, like we call it modern Italy, where the Republic of Italy is today. And then over time, you can see it grew into this massive empire, called the Roman Empire later in modern times. And it peaked at about 2 million square miles. If you look at that actual map, you can see the Roman state, this empire controlled vast amounts of land that controlled the majority of Europe. See Spain, France, Italy, the area around Greece and Macedonia, Britain, part of Germany a little bit, Then you can see southwestern Asia, controlled like around where Turkey is today, Mesopotamia, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. And then in North Africa, you can see it stretched from around Egypt all the way to Morocco at one point. So that's about the landmass of where Rome was at one point, and they controlled that area around the Mediterranean Sea for many centuries. And they think that the population of the empire varies. I know 50, 60 million is a minimum. I think I've seen as high as 90 million, which I don't know if it got that high in population, but they do think it controlled at least 20% of the world's population at the time. It's probably a little bit bigger than the Persian Empire before, and maybe Alexander's empire in comparison, but it's close. I think I've seen numbers maybe. I think the square miles varies. I've seen 1.8 to 2.3 million square miles is roughly the size of maybe how big it was landmass wise. Here's, by the way, a map showing you where modern Italy is, which you can see that famous boot of Italy, its peninsula. You can see it's kind of situated between, you know, those former Yugoslavian countries like Croatia, Serbia, etc. Then you can see to the west, you've got France. To the north is Switzerland, Austria. And then you've got, of course, North Africa. That's, of course, across the Mediterranean Sea. So you see that's all the landmass it's situated today. And you can see Rome kind of started in the middle of Italy. They believe that Rome began along what they call the Tiber River and its seven hills, which the most famous hill they always talk about is the Palatine Hill, which I think I've got an image showing that. Kind of show kind of an image of Rome, which Rome, by the way, has different nicknames. They call it sometimes the Eternal City, the City of the Seven Hills. That, of course, the city was founded around right here. And you can see the Tiber River kind of running there. And then you've got those seven hills that are kind of to the, I guess, to the east of it right there, which the most famous one is kind of in the middle, the Palatine Hill. Then you got all those other hills that are around it: Aventine Hill, Capitoline Hill, Caelian Hill, Escaline Hill, Viminial Hill, and Corinial Hill as well. Then you can see on the left there, that's kind of an image of the Roman Forum with the Palatine Hill right above it. So yeah, 8th century, that's traditionally the date of when they think the Romans started. I think the famous date when they think it started was 753 BC, but that's probably a mythological type date. I know it's a date that I think the Romans used to count back to or something like that. But traditionally, probably the center of the 8th century, that's about when maybe they think Rome was founded. Here's kind of an image also showing all the different peoples that settled in Italy. One of the most famous was the Etruscans, which I think that may have been the oldest type of European peoples that settled in Italy, maybe 3,000 years ago. But actually, the Romans were a mix of peoples. I think those three are kind of the main groups that they kind of mix up to eventually become what we call Romans in ancient Italy. You've got the Etruscans, which are in the north, especially around like the Po River Valley. And then you got the Latin peoples of Italy, which are kind of in the central part of Italy. Area sometimes called Latium, I think is the name they use. Then the Greeks are more on the bottom, where like Naples is in Sicily, that green area. And Etruscans, they think, are older. I think there's a theory that maybe they go back before 1000 BC and settled in the northern part of Italy. And they're kind of in an area now called Tuscany, which I think the modern actually the ancient name they call it a long time ago. I put it on the screen here. It's called Etruria, I think is the term. Yeah, Etruria, ancient Etruria. And then the modern name is Tuscany, that they called it today. They do think the Etruscans were a major influence on the Romans, like their culture. I think there's even a theory that maybe their early language may have been kind of influenced by them as well. And then to more to the south, you've got the Greeks that are on the bottom. And a lot of the Romans would call the southern part of Italy, they would call it Magna Graecia, which means in Latin, Great Greece or Greater Greece. And it's called that because the fact that that area was kind of influential to the Romans. A lot of their culture kind of filtered up from the south, so they get a lot of ideas about not just culture but religion, architecture, philosophy, and other things that the Greeks were kind of influential in. Of course, the Greek language was also adopted as well by the Romans. That led to the rise of a lot of early cities. There's one I'll kind of get to that's kind of famous early on called Alba Longa. Alba Longa was one of several of these kind of list of Latin cities I've got there that kind of developed around that area of central Italy, which was an area I think they call it sometimes Latium, I think was the name, which supposedly was derived from a famous ancient king of Italy named Latinus, uh, who I think that's kind of where the name Latin comes from in the language, the name of the language. And so you have all these different cities that kind of emerge in that area close to the Tiber River. Ardea and a few others you see in that list. I think Lavinium was kind of one that was kind of famous. And over time, that would develop into what we call Rome and the Romans. And then they, of course, would absorb other people into it over several centuries. Now, there's one story I'm going to get to that's really famous about the Romans, if you know about it. It's the story of Romulus and Remus and how they think Rome was founded. Part of that has to do with, they think, mythologies. They're not sure if all these stories are really true. There's even a theory that they may have been developed later in Roman history. But according to legend, if you know about it, Rome was founded close to about that mid 8th century BC by these twins named Romulus and Remus. You see in that image on the right. And the story goes is that they were actually descended from the god Mars, the god of war, who we also call Ares. And I'll kind of get to it later. They were kind of part god because their mother was raped by the god Mars. I've got other images. I'll get to the famous she-wolf, which is often associated with Romulus and Remus and the founding of Rome. It's often called the so-called Capitoline wolf, you may have heard of. But here's kind of some images, of course, of Romulus and Remus right there. Supposedly, they were the grandsons of this king named Numitor, who ruled that city I was telling you about called Alba Longa, like an early Latin city in Italy. But what happened was his brother stole his throne. His brother was named Amulius, and he would seize the throne. And I think he later had his daughter killed. Her name was Rhea Silvia, but Rhea Silvia was famous for supposedly being raped by the god Mars. And that's how the twins were born. They were born from this union between Rhea Silvia and Mars. Here I got an image showing, I guess, Numitor in Amulia. So Numitor basically got his throne stolen. I think he was imprisoned by Amulius. And then Amulius, what he did was he took the twins, after I guess they were born, he put them in a basket and floated them on the Tiber River, I guess hoping that they would drown. And what happened, though, if you know about it, a she-wolf found them. And I guess they suckled off her teats, basically, until someone found them. And so that was considered a miracle to the Romans in ancient times. And I think I've got an image showing like Mars and Rhea Silvia, of course, that with that. But basically, what would happen afterwards, um, apparently there was this local shepherd named Faustulus that found the twins, I guess being suckled by the she wolf, and took them in and raised them to adulthood. And so what happened afterwards, the twins grew up, they went back and they killed Amulius and put their grandfather back on the throne. So Numitor got his throne back and all that. And then the twins started building, the city of Rome after they wanted to build their own city, I guess have their own mark and all that. And so that's what ended up happening. They start building their city, but if you go to that map there, they started quarreling over the construction of the city. And one of the things that's very famous about Romulus and Remus is that Romulus supposedly killed Remus over conflict over the building of the city. And so from there, uh, the famous thing that happened, of course, with that was that Romulus then became the first king of the Romans. Now, is that a true story? They're not sure. They think it might be based on a lot of mythology. There may have been, Romulus and Remus, and Romulus may have killed his brother. It's quite possible. It sounds like the Cain and Abel story in the Bible. But it's a very famous story in Roman history. And I think all the Romans believed it was a true story, by the way. So anyway, that's how the founding of Rome, of course, came to be. And of course, Romulus founded the initial city on the Palatine Hill, 753 BC, of course, being the popular date of maybe when they founded it. There, of course, is the Capitoline wolf. I'll kind of show you that image right there of the Capitoline wolf. But that particular wolf became kind of a symbol of the story of Romulus and Remus and the miracle, I guess, of them being saved by the wolf. And over time, that became like a symbol of Rome and all that. Kind of debated about when that statue was built. I think there's a new theory that it may not have been made till later, but these statues may have existed back in ancient times from a long time ago. Other symbols, of course, the Romans also adopt, if you know about it, is the famous fasci symbol, which the fasci symbol is a symbol of power of the monarchs originally. Later, of course, the magistrates that rule over the people and the military. And supposedly the word fasci comes from a Latin term meaning bundle. It was a bundle of sticks or rods that were bound together with an axe. And supposedly the rods represented the fact that the Roman people were many but one. And I believe that the fasci sometimes would be used to execute people originally, like a long time ago. But it showed like the power of those that were, you know, over others, like a king or magistrate, or I guess later the emperors of Rome. And I'll get to it later, but they even bring in other symbols like the eagle symbol, if you know about it, is also brought in too, kind of mixed with that. And the eagle symbol, I think, was more connected to like the god Jupiter, which is Zeus. If you know about it later in modern times, Benito Mussolini adopted the fasci symbol in the early 20th century in Italy, and that led to the so-called fascist movement, which was popular in Europe for these right-wing political parties that wanted to restore, Italy like to similar to the Romans. And so the term fascism, the term fascist, fascism kind of was born from that, of course, name a long time ago. So it's kind of talking about some of those, symbols that are kind of associated, not just with the Romans, by the way. The fasci was kind of borrowed by a lot of people. I think even in America, the fasci's been kind of borrowed, symbol of the Roman Republic in its state. Now, of course, one thing about also Romulus, I was talking about, Romulus did go on to populate the city of Rome. They didn't have any women, and so Romulus had to go out and get other tribes to join. So he did go to like, I think, one tribe nearby called the Sabines, and kind of forced them to join. And they made paintings about it where Romulus went in and seized these people. And there's a very famous painting right there, I know, by Jacques Louis David, I think in the late 18th century, called The Intervention of the Sabine Women, sometimes called the rape of the Sabine women. They're kind of seized by the Romans and forced to be part of the state. But that's something that they start, kind of going on where they start getting other people to join their state. And then, of course, over time, they're eventually going to gobble up all of Italy and absorb it into a Roman state over time. Now, I'll kind of talk about first before I get started. There's some of the different sources that kind of write on the Romans, because where do we get all these information about ancient Rome from a long time ago? Well, besides archaeology, which is kind of important in Roman history, you do have like these different sources there I've got that are kind of the most famous, especially the ones that are in that list right there. You've got the one on the left and the one in the center are probably the most important ones they have, such as Livy, also known as Titus Livius. And his book is sometimes called Ab Urbe Condite Libre, which means from the founding, books from the founding of the city, where this ancient historian who lived about close to about the first century BC, when Emperor Augustus lived, he wrote a series of books about Rome from its beginnings, from like, I guess, going back to the time of Romulus and Remus in the 8th century BC. It goes all the way to the time of like close to Julius Caesar's time. And it was written in 142 books. So it's one of the most massive historical works ever written about Rome. However, only about 1/4 of it still exists. So about 35 of the 142 books still exist. I think Livy kind of romanticizes a lot of the stories about Rome, but so do other authors as well in the Greco-Roman world. The one in the middle is famous too, which is Parallel Lives, which Plutarch was a famous Greek writer who wrote like mostly biographies. He's got a series of books where he compares Greek to Roman nobility. Like he compares like Julius Caesar to Alexander the Great, but he gives a lot of information about the Roman nobility. Like you got Romulus, Scipio Africanus, Marius, Sulla, Crassus, Brutus, Julius Caesar, Cicero, Mark Antony. I think that might be some of the most famous Romans that he talks about. He gives a lot of information on some of the kings as well. But that's important because you do get not just, autobiographical information about these different statesmen, but you get information as well about the early Roman state going back to the monarchy and the republic as well. I kind of throw in Virgil, which I don't know, that's not really a historical work, but Virgil does kind of go into some of the early history of Rome as well in the Aeneid, which the Aeneid is a famous epic about the Trojan hero Aeneas, how he survived the sack of Troy and traveled throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And there he goes to North Africa, where he visits Queen Dido, Carthage, and then eventually goes to Italy as well. And they think Aeneas, somehow there's a connection with Aeneas and the later Latin peoples. And they think he founded cities in Italy that'll later be related to like Alba Longa and all these other cities that start sprouting up in central Italy. Believe it or not, the Romans believed that they were descended from the Trojans. This is something they believed. In fact, a lot of famous Romans would trace their lineage back to Aeneas. I think even Julius Caesar tried that. And so a lot of them thought that they were kind of important. There's other writers too we'll talk about later. Polybius was a famous writer, wrote about the Romans, especially around the Punic Wars. And after that, I think was one. I think Appian is another one that's important. Julius Caesar, believe it or not, in the first century had some historical works that he wrote that are kind of important, especially in the first century BC. I think those are some of the main ones that are kind of famous around that time. And a few, Dio Cassius, that's another one I was kind of mentioning, kind of goes into it We'll also get to the famous writer and historian Tacitus. He was big too, as well. Right, let me get into the Roman monarchy. So the Romans first had a monarchy before they would actually have a republican type state that would come in. And they think the Roman monarchy starts about 753 BC. It goes up to about 510, 509 is about when it kind of ended overall. It's called different names too, by the way. This one's called the Regal period, I think is another name that they nickname it. And they think this state, this Roman kingdom, which it was, formed out of a confederation of Latin states that were there, which I told you were called, they call it sometimes Latium, the area, but the actual confederation was called the Latin League. And it was made up of, I forget how many exactly, but I gave you a list of different city states. Like Alba Longa was one of them originally, but Rome would grow to be the main one that would swallow up all the other ones over time. I've got a list showing you the kings right here. So they had like only 7 kings that they had, starting with Romulus, who of course was the first king that they had. And the kings were elected for life. They often ruled with absolute power, which I think the term they sometimes used for that was imperium, which is kind of where you get the word imperial or empire later from. And a lot of their power, I told you, was associated with the fasci symbol. They had the power over others to, law and so on, or put people to death and things like that. And so those are your different kings that you had. So Numa Pompilius, they had Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and Tarquin the Proud. Uh, Interesting thing about those other ones after Romulus, um, like Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, and Ancus Marcius, kind of a mouthful, I know. Those were mostly Sabine kings, because I told you the Sabines had been kind of brought in to the Roman state. And the last three, kind of the Tarquins there, those are like Etruscan kings that would also reign over the Roman state, because the Etruscans kind of become powerful in the north. They kind of control Rome for like a short time. I think some that are kind of famous. There's one I'll kind of mention about now that's well known, but they think like the one I've got here. I'll kind of get to the rape of Lucretia in a second, but Servius Tullius, I think, was one that was real famous. He's one that built the Servian Wall. You may have heard of, which were a series of defensive walls that were put around the Roman city that helped defend the city for many centuries until the Aurelian Wall was built later in the 3rd century CE. It was like much later when that is like several hundred centuries later. So he's kind of famous. Tarquin the Proud, I think, is another that's kind of famous because of the fact that he was the last king of the Romans who was deposed around maybe 510, 509 BC. And we'll get to his son later. His son had a lot to do with why he got deposed. His son did something bad that was kind of well known. I'll kind of mention about with that. That's something I'll kind of talk about now. The rape of Lucretia or Lucretia, of course, is very famous in Roman history. They say that this incident was one of the things that really precipitated the monarchy, the kingdom being overthrown. Apparently, there was an incident where the son of Tarquin the Proud, the last king of the Romans, raped this woman named Lucretia, who was some kind of Roman noblewoman, and it instigated a rebellion against the monarchs. And the Romans said that they wouldn't have any more monarchs after that. And so basically what happened, you get these 2 men that come in that form the Roman Republic, which are her relatives. Apparently she was so embarrassed about being raped by Sextus Tarquinius, that she committed suicide, and so her relatives were the ones that established the Roman Republic around maybe the year 509 BC. And these would be these two men, which are right here. I think I've got an image of them right here, which are Lucius Junius Brutus, which is on the left, and then Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus on the right. I don't think there's any statues of him as far as I know. But basically, Lucius Junius Brutus was the uncle of Lucretia, and then the other one, Collatinus, was her husband. So those are the two that actually would found the actual Roman Republic that would come in at that point. So you get this state that comes in. Those two, by the way, are going to start really being the first, not just the co-founders of it, but they'll be eventually the first, what they call Roman consuls that run the Roman Republic. Because if you know what happens, the Brutus and Collatinus, they basically replace the actual power of the kings. They become these chief magistrates called a Roman consul, and those become like the head of this actual state under the Republic. Later, when they have the empire, they're not as powerful. They're more appointed by the Roman emperors. But that's kind of what happened with the monarchy. They did away with the monarchy, and then they brought in, of course, this Republican state at that point. Now, what exactly is a republic? We kind of know that today in the United States. A republic is like a type of government. It's kind of like democracy, but it's based on a mostly representative democracy where they have representatives that are elected to basically uh, support the people or represent the people. And the term republic, by the way, well, first of all, let me talk about it's almost like an oligarchy. That's the weird thing, though, about the Roman Republic. Um, Mostly controlled by the upper classes. It's kind of like today, the United States seems like it, where like upper classes, like the elites, seem to have more power than anything. But I'll get to the patricians later. The patricians tend to control most of the power in the Republic. And the patricians are basically these aristocrats that are descended back to the founding of Rome. I think they say that they kind of related or, descended from Romulus and his people. And so the word patrician develops in the word father, from the word pater, in Latin father, as the so-called fathers of Rome from a long time ago. And by the way, the term republic is derived from the word res publica, which means either public affairs or commonwealth dealing with the people in general. And so that's the origin of where we get the word republic or republican from over time, republicanism and things like that. By the way, the Romans would often call their state, they called it SPQR. I don't know if you heard of that before, SPQR. But it stands for the Senate and the Roman people, or if you want the Latin, Senatus Populus Romanus. It's actually the name of the government that runs the actual Roman state, not only the state itself, but it's a name that is often used during the Republic, and then later it's used during the Roman Empire as well. And I think I've got images kind of showing you SPQR, which is right here, but it's often symbolized by initials. You won't see any punctuation in it because they didn't have punctuation back in ancient times. But you'll see it in a lot of images, like on walls, and they'll put it on standards and things like that. Like you got the SPQR symbol with the eagle being used, or the wolf, and things like that as well. So represented the Senate, we'll get to a little later, Roman Senate, which is like the main assembly that the Romans are kind of known for with the Republic. And then, of course, the Roman people themselves, which are made up of different social classes of people. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. Let me just show you here that I'll kind of get into the Romans right here with the structure of government. They kind of like the Romans had different social classes. They were kind of well known, which some of them had certain powers in the government, and then some didn't. If you know about that. And he had mostly two main classes that you had in the Republican state. You had the so called patricians I was talking about, which are like aristocrats or nobility that go back to the founding of Rome, like back to the time of Romulus and Remus. And then you got your plebes or plebeians, which are like your common peoples, which make up majority of the people in Rome. And I think I had another image I thought showing the different social classes. I thought I had somewhere that had there. There's right there the different social classes. Here's kind of an image of that right there. But yeah, you can see the patricians own most of the land. It's famous about that. And then you can see they were only a small population, so 5-10% of the population. They held most of the power. It was kind of a small group of aristocratic families that did this in Rome. You know, like the families going back to the time of like Julius Caesar, all that. Then you got your plebeians. Most of the plebeians are like farmers, artisans, merchants. That's about it. Kind of like examples. Majority of the population, they lack power, especially when the republic was founded. Monarchy too, they lack power as well. And then your lowest classes are like the slaves. They're on the bottom. And most of the slaves in the Roman world probably made up anywhere from about 1/4 to 1/3 of the population. A lot of these slaves were gotten from all the different conquests, of course, of the Romans, that they've had over multiple centuries. I think they had other classes too, besides slaves. They do have these other classes like equites, which is kind of like a upper middle class between the patricians and plebes. Often called the so-called equestrian class or knights, and they rose up to become very wealthy, mostly in business. And I think a lot of also came out of the cavalry, the Roman cavalry, in the armies as well. But women, uh, you had patrician women, plebeian women, and things like that. But women weren't equal to men in all that, and quite often the father was the head of the household. Paterfamilia, I think, was the Latin term they used, of course, for that. Now, showing that image there, by the way, of the different structure of the government of the republic. The Roman government included multiple consuls, like they had all these different assemblies that they had. By the way, the Romans don't call an assembly, they don't call it like a consul, they call it a committee, from the Latin term comitia, basically. They had up to at least four major assemblies they had. They had the Roman Senate, which was more situated with the senators and the senatorial class and the so-called patricians, plebeian consul, which was more for like the plebes and the common people, tribal consul, which was for like all the different tribes of the Romans they had, which was based off of different social classes. Centurion consul was also another assembly for the military, which was composed of both patricians and plebes also as well. But you can see there on the left, they had two Roman consuls. Those were like the heads of the state, which were chief magistrates that were the highest one you could be elected to, which you would serve like 1 year term. Traditionally, it was elected, I think, mostly patricians to that position right there. And the Roman consuls were famous for running the government, also directing the armies, like in wars and battles and things like that. The consuls could also act as judges as well. And they also could appoint like a dictator or become a dictator themselves in the case of emergencies and things like that. The Roman consul was very famous for having what they call veto power, if you've heard of that, where they could veto the other consul or veto other magistrates that are below them. Also, the senators were mostly, like I said, patricians. On average, under the Republic, there were about 300 senators that served on the Roman Senate. It was a life term if you got chosen to be on the Senate. And the Senate was mostly an advisory body. They advised the consuls. They advised the assemblies and things like that. They directed spending. They did a lot of stuff with the money, things like that. They approved or disapproved of laws made by the assemblies, and then they made decisions about foreign powers, treaties, and things like that. And then the plebeians, like I told you, had their own assembly, like the plebeian council. It's called different names, and they could also elect consuls too. I'll get to it later, but the plebes have what they call tribunes also as well. That are these magistrates of the plebes, which are about 10 of those. And the plebeian assembly could elect also officials, including judges. They can even elect their own, well, they can vote in laws that are called plebiscites as well. And they can even declare war or peace as well. So both those main assemblies, the Roman Senate and the plebeian assembly, had a lot of power in the Roman Republic overall. They do have a lot of different magistrates, of course, that run the Roman Republic. I do want to admit, like I said, the highest magistrate was the Roman consuls, which there were two of those. Like I said, they elected for 1 year terms. And after you serve your term, they would elect two more, every year, basically. The consuls, like I said, replaced the monarch. When they got rid of the kings, they came into power and helped run the state. And then over time, what happened was when the empire came in with the Roman emperors, the consuls become less powerful. And they're appointed by the Roman emperors instead. Oh, by the way, if you want to reach Roman consul, traditionally under the Republic, you had to start on the bottom. Like you had to go through like the lesser magistrative type positions uh, through a course called the cursus honorum, or honorable courses usually called. And so you start with like lesser type, magistrative positions, like a quaestor or something like that. But you also had to have military service. Usually they wanted you to have some kind of military service, and then be elected to lesser type magistrative positions, and then eventually you would be elected to consul. But very few people made it that far, you know, over time. Yeah, other positions that are in the government too that are kind of famous under the Republic. They had what they call the quaestor. The quaestor was like a type of Roman public official, usually elected in the Republic. They dealt with like the money, like the treasury, Roman treasury. They did audits, of the Roman treasury and things like that. And so there's like numerous of these officials that they would elect. That was considered like a lower magistrative position. You kind of start at the bottom. Uh, the Adel, or I think it's the call, or I think it's actually pronounced Adeli, I think is how I say it in Latin, were these public officials. That was another elected position. That particular public official was famous for electing like, well, they would run like the games, like all the public games. They would put on the gladiatorial events, Circus Maximus. They would run the Colosseum. They dealt with the food supply. They maintained all the buildings, the temples, things like that. And so that was another kind of considered like a lower magistrative position you could be elected to as well. And then the praetor, that's a position which was like considered like a higher magistrative position to be elected to. That dealt with like mostly law. So they're kind of like these people in the Roman courts, judicial settings, and praetors could also lead troops in the battle like Roman consuls could as well. So they dealt with Roman law, but also military matters as well. Another high magistrative position, which was pretty prestigious, was the Roman censor, which you would be elected to every 5 years, 5-year term, which two of them were elected at the same time. And the Roman censor dealt with the Roman census, which was a head count of the population of Rome, which was usually done for not just population, but for taxation purposes to figure out how much they had to tax the people, things like that. They also dealt with censorship. So they would censor certain things against the name. They also dealt with public morality. So they thought something was immoral, they would have it banned. They also dealt with like overseeing a lot of the finances of the state, like infrastructure, building buildings, and things like that. They also did as well. There's a lot of censors that are kind of famous, like Cato the Elder, I think, was kind of one that was kind of a famous censor who was sometimes called Cato the Censor, who I think lived in the 2nd century BC. So it's kind of talking about these different positions. There's other public positions that are kind of that are elected to original republic, but over time, when the empire comes in, eventually you'll see a deal where the emperors start appointing everybody. Here's kind of another kind of, you want to show it right here for later, all the different ones, but you can see like the quaestors are kind of on the bottom, aedile, praetors and consuls. You can see in that order from bottom to up right there. They have also what they call tribunes, which are these representatives of the plebeians, which were kind of important under the Republic, which 10 of them were elected. They supposedly had veto power too, just like the Roman consuls had. So they were kind of considered very powerful. I'll talk about the Gracchi brothers later. They're kind of famous, tribunes that are well known, like around the 2nd century BC. So let me talk about some other things. Of course, now the Romans eventually have a quarrel that happens in Rome that's known as they call it different names. There's kind of a deal where, kind of show it right here, but it's called the conflict of the orders or struggle of the orders that happened between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC. And what happened was the plebes and the patricians got into a conflict after the republic was founded because the plebes didn't have any rights. And so there was this power struggle to get more rights. And what happened was in 494 BC, they think is the year, the plebes went on strike. They refused to like work with patricians or do business with them. There was even a case where they refused to serve in the Roman military. Like I think they made the bulk up of the Roman military, the common peoples. And so over time, the patricians were kind of forced to give them rights, which the two big things they had that happened before this was in the 5th century, the plebeians got their own assembly. I was talking about, which is the plebeian council or plebeian assembly. So they think founded in maybe 471 BC, and they allowed the plebeians to create laws, which are called plebiscites. And then they also allowed them to elect their own magistrates that they're called tribunes, which 10 of them were, elected every year. I think they served like 1-year terms like the consuls did. And they're kind of considered almost an equal power to the patricians, consuls that they of course would elect also as well. Then the big thing that happened too, you see there around the year 450 BC, they then codified a bunch of Roman laws that became known as the 12 tables. They're called 12 tables, by the way, because they were supposedly carved on 12 tablets, which I think were copper engraved originally and it was originally hung in the forum like a long time ago. And the power struggle itself and the 12 laws led to the foundation of what we call Roman law, the Roman Constitution. And so a lot of the bases of Roman laws, go back to the 12 tables from a long time ago. But they do think that the 12 tables were originally created to settle disputes between patricians and plebes. That's why they created it. But over time, it became mostly laws that were dealt with civil matters. You can see it also formed basic legal procedures and appropriate punishments for people that commit crimes and things like that. And also, it distinguished between those that are free, those that are rich and poor, and those that are also slaves as well. So that's kind of talking about the so-called um, 12 tables that become well known. Now, they also got what they call the Roman Forum as well. The Roman Forum, that becomes the center of where the government is in Rome. You basically get this deal where the central part of the city, kind of like we saw with the Greeks. And we were talking about the Greeks had the agora that they had, where they have this town square. Well, the Romans do the same thing. They have this public square where the Roman government meets, and that's where they conduct, political matters of the state. Also, where they built a lot of their temples. You can see it's also, where they would have a lot of their markets, entertainment, baths, and things like that. And the actual Roman Forum was not built, in one day. If you know about Rome, they used to say Rome wasn't built in a day. It was built over many centuries. And the actual location of the Forum, it's actually located between the Palatine and the Capitoline Hill. It's kind of in a valley between those two hills. It's very famous for a lot of its buildings and ruins, which are still there today, which a lot of these, the ruins of the Forum took their toll over centuries as the Roman Empire declined and people sacked Rome and things like that. But obviously, a lot of tourists visit the Roman Forum. Close to about 4 to 5 million probably visit it annually in modern Italy today. It does have nicknames. The Roman Forum, they usually just call it the Forum, if you know about that. They usually call it either the Forum Romanum, or the other name they would call it would be the Forum Magnum, which means Great Forum. So those are the common names that people call it. But most Roman cities, like at least major cities anyway, had some kind of forum. It was like a town square that was part of the city, where all these things, of course, went on. And Rome, by the way, was connected by many roads. That's one thing about the Romans. They had all these different thousands of roads that were built throughout the Roman Mediterranean world, which linked Rome with other cities. And of course, there's a lot of sayings they would say about Rome, like when in Rome, do the things that the Romans, of course, do. Of course, all roads lead to Rome. I think they would say also as well about the Roman city. But the actual forum itself was built, like I said, over many centuries. You've got deals where, I'll get to it later, but you have Roman emperors that would kind of add on and have their own forums that they kind of extend into it. But you can see a lot of buildings are, within walking distance. Like you can see in the background there, you can see the Roman Colosseum, not that far away. Circus Maximus, not that far away, and things like that. Here's other images. You can see that's the actual Roman Forum, of course, from the Palatine Hill. That's right there. I think that's like some kind of ancient palace that was there that they think went back to the time of like around the 1st century of Tiberius and Caligula. I think there was a palace of Augustus that was originally there. I think it was torn down. All that. Of course, you had the Great Fire of Rome, which burned out a lot of things that was, of course, originally there. So you can see it's mostly ruins today, the Roman Forum. Now I want to get in next, and I want to talk about, of course, one major event in Roman history, which is the so-called Punic Wars that occur between the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC. Rome at that time was starting to expand and take over all of Italy. They took over, I think, the northern part first, and they took over the southern part by about the mid third century. And in the mid third century, they have a series of wars that break out, which are called the Punic Wars. They were a series of wars between the Roman Republic and then this other state we've talked about before, which is the Carthaginian Empire. They usually call it Rome versus Carthage and all that. And if you remember correctly, the Carthaginian Empire was this massive empire that emerged in North Africa that was founded by the Phoenicians. And you've got this image right here, but you can see here that it was actually not one war. It was a series of three wars between Carthage and Rome. I'll get to it later, but we have the first Punic War, second Punic War, third Punic War that you have. It caused a lot of deaths, which is true. They think 1 to 2 million may have been killed in the Punic Wars. Second Punic War was the bloodiest of the three wars they had. And you look at that, Carthage itself, was the reason why the wars happened. You've got Carthage, controlling parts of the Western Mediterranean world, like North Africa, some of the islands like Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. They're a big naval power, in the Mediterranean Sea. And then you got Rome, in Italy, which is kind of rising to power. They're more known for their land armies and all that. That's going to create kind of a deal where the two are going to eventually come to loggerheads. There you go, the Carthaginian Empire. I think we talked about that particular empire before, but remember, it was founded by Queen Dido back in the 9th century BC, that famous Phoenician princess that came to where now Tunisia is in North Africa. She founded the city of Carthage from that. And over time, the Romans will kind of they do call them the Phoenicians is the name that, of course, that the Romans do call them. Although they have their own name, they nickname them, which is basically the so-called Punicus, I think is the term they use, the Latin term, or they have another term which is Punici as well, which is like the Greek variation of it. But basically, it's the name meaning, Phoenician in the Roman name. And so that's why they call it the Punic Wars, which basically means the Phoenician Wars, because they knew who they were fighting, the Romans, mostly the Phoenicians. But Phoenicians weren't really just one people. I think I talked about this before. They're kind of a multi-ethnic empire, which is made up of many peoples, like in North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, Spain, and so on. And their peak of power, they think the population of this empire may have been somewhere between 3 to 4 million people. It's mostly a trading empire known for its naval power, merchant fleets, like you see in that image. But they do acquire a lot of mercenaries, in their armies. Here's kind of the city of Carthage, which they think the city of Carthage, I think I've talked about this before, was actually larger than Rome City. Now, there's different estimates on the size of it, but I know it was at least 600,000 or more when they fought the Romans. I think the city of Rome was half that size in comparison. And the ruins of Carthage are now in where Tunis is. Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. That's where, of course, it was based in North Africa. Here's kind of a map showing you where the Carthaginian Empire was based, and you can see the peak of their empire was about 3rd century BC. I think I've talked about this before. And you can see all the areas that they control. So they controlled parts of North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and part of Libya. It's about where it was in North Africa, with Carthage being where Tunisia is now. Part of Sicily was controlled by them, Sardinia, Corsica, Part of Spain was also controlled by them, and some of the islands also in the Western Mediterranean as well. There's different sources that talk about the actual punic wars. I'll kind of briefly talk about that before I get in the actual conflict. But Polybius, they consider his work to be really the most influential, that really gives us a history of the Punic Wars. Polybius as the oldest work that goes back the furthest. So he was writing, I think I want to say close to about the second century. It's about when he's writing. So he's kind of around when the Third Punic War happens. And so he gives a complete history of the Punic Wars from the beginning to its conclusion when the Carthaginians are destroyed, in the wars. And then the other one is Livy, who I've talked about before, does have a series of books, which you can see the history of Rome, books 21 through 25. It's 5 books which go into the Punic Wars. Livy tends to concentrate more, I think, on the Second Punic War, which was sometimes called usually the War with Hannibal, or Hannibalic War is what they sometimes nickname it. There's another writer named Appian who writes later in the Roman Empire, 2nd century CE, but he's not as well known, kind of much later compared to Polybius and Livy. That gives most of the history. Now, I want to get first a little bit into the First Punic War. The First Punic War was more of a naval conflict. Part of why the Punic Wars broke out was because of Sicily. Sicily was the main reason for why it occurred. Both wanted to control Sicily because Sicily, for several reasons. One was that it was an area where you could use it as a port to, I guess, leapfrog from, say, Italy to Africa, which the Romans were thinking of. And then I think the Carthaginians thought the opposite, that they could take Sicily and then take Italy that way also. Sicily's also a breadbasket, so they put a lot of crops there as well. And then, of course, control the ports. I guess you control the ports there. You control a lot of the parts of the Mediterranean Sea, especially in the west. And so there were a lot of naval engagements during the war. They also fought on Sicily. I think they also fought a little bit in North Africa as well. But one thing that the Romans did that was successful about the war, they were able to develop their own navy. And how they did that was they actually took captured Carthaginian ships and built them from scratch, their own ships, like the so-called quinquereme you're looking at right here, these Roman galley ships. They used that to decimate the Carthaginians' naval power. I think there's something that's famous too about their early ships. I know in the First War they built this thing called a corvus, which is a corvus was like this landing bridge that they would use on the ships to basically take other ships. They would, I guess, come up on a ship and throw the landing bridge down and then take it. And so it was kind of this secret weapon that they devised, the Romans, to kind of turn naval battles into almost like land battles in a sense. So the so-called corvus. But yeah, the Romans, starting, I guess, between the 3rd and 2nd century, start to dominate the Mediterranean Sea naval-wise. And I think for many centuries after that, the Roman navies control everything throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, of course, the big thing that happened, between the First and the Second Wars, one of the things that happened after the First War ended was that Rome took control of Sicily. They took that island, and then after that, they even took over Sicily. And they took, besides Sicily, they took Corsica and Sardinia as well. It's kind of to the west of Italy. And because of that, the Romans are going to have to fight Hannibal later. We're going to get to Hannibal, of course, a little bit today, a little background into that. But one thing that happened that's very famous, Hannibal had this father whose name was Hamilcar Barca. You may have heard of him. He was this Carthaginian general that fought in the first war, of course, lost. And so one thing that the uh, Carthaginians did between the First and Second Punic War was they took over Spain and they started colonizing it. And it was called either Iberia or I think the Romans called it Hispania later. And so um, Hannibal was just like a child when this was kind of all going on. And I think there was a deal where when his father left to go conquer and take over Spain, he made Hannibal promise that he would always be an enemy to Rome. And that's something that he, of course, eventually does, of course, over time. By the way, the Hannibal's family was part of a nobility of Carthaginians that were called the Barcids. It was like a bunch of family members that would go on to become real big generals in the Carthaginians empire. Hamilcar, and then he had like three sons: Hannibal, Hasdrubal, Mago, who would all be famous Roman generals that would fight in the Punic Wars. And it's kind of like an intergenerational war. I think by the Third Punic War, you even got another. I think there's a grandson of Hannibal called Hasdrubal that fights the Romans when Carthage gets sacked in 146 as well. So you've got all these different Barcids that are kind of fighting, of course, against the Romans. But Hannibal, a little about him. He's really the most famous of the Barcids. Hannibal is very well known for being one of the greatest military minds in ancient times. A lot of people kind of see him as this genius that is the father of military strategy. And Hannibal is eventually going to start a war, which will be the so-called Second Punic War, which will break out around 218 BC. Hannibal, takes over Spain over time, and then he seeks revenge against the Romans. And we'll talk about it later. Kind of shows this image right here. But Hannibal's going to take his forces, which are in Spain, the southern part of Spain. He's going to march into Italy and attack. He's going to invade. Actually, it's kind of amazing, but about Hannibal, he was very famous for taking his army through the mountains of Italy, so-called Alps, so-called crossing of the Alps by Hannibal. I think he took something like 100,000 troops through northern Italy, which surprised the Romans in this war. And it was a huge army, like 100,000 troops, like infantry, cavalry. Hannibal also was famous for using elephants as well. And he would actually lose like half his force as he would kind of get into northern Italy, but it would shock the Romans. The Romans would be just their forces, if you know about it, would be obliterated in the first few years against his tactics of Hannibal. And one thing about the Romans saw Hannibal as this boogeyman, this kind of ghost in the closet or demon under your bed that they were always fearful would destroy Rome. And the old saying about Hannibal was, Hannibal is at the gates. And so it was an old, actually, I think it was an old wives' tale or something, or saying that nursemaids would tell children if they wouldn't go to bed or they were being bad, they would tell them Hannibal's going to get you, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think I've got a map showing you the kind of the route that Hannibal takes from Spain through the Pyrenees into like where now southern France is. And then you can see he marched through the northern part of Italy through the Alps, crossing through the mountains with maybe an army that may have been close to like 100,000 men at that point. And he attacked into northern Italy. And if you know about a lot of the early battles, their forces were almost obliterated by Hannibal and his tactics. Battle of, I think they have Battle of Trebia in 218, and then Battle of Lake Trasimene was another battle in 217, where the Roman forces were badly beaten in both those battles. There was this Roman general, by the way, I'll kind of mention, he's also a Roman consul. His name was Fabius. And Fabius wanted to use guerrilla tactics to fight against Hannibal. And they thought he was a coward. They wanted to, attack Hannibal's forces, mano a mano, I guess, with a full army. And so they thought he was trying to delay the inevitable, fighting Hannibal. They later find out that this guy, Fabius, he was right. His policies actually end up as part of why they win the wars later, of course, with the second one. And so they amassed this huge army, which, of course, we'll get to the Battle of Cannae, of course. That's real famous, of course, which happens in August of 216 BC. The Romans bring up an army of something like 90,000, or almost 90,000 troops to try to trap Hannibal in the southern part of Italy. I've got some images, by the way, showing the actual battlefield of what is Cannae, which Cannae is like a small little village in southern Italy where the actual battle would take place between the two sides. It's kind of debate about the saying of the name. Cannae, I've heard also Cannae, I think pronounced also that way as well. I've got kind of a map showing you like the battle of the two different forces that were really involved. Hannibal only had about 40,000 troops. It's pretty amazing. I think he was outnumbered like basically 2-1 in the battle. However, if you look at that map of the battle, Hannibal actually put his forces in kind of a V formation, which was really a trap. This is when the Romans attacked with their infantry, their legions in the center. Hannibal basically formed this kind of envelopment of their forces where he drove off their cavalry off the battlefield. So I think at the beginning of the war, the Carthaginians had a more superior cavalry than the Romans did. And what ends up happening, Hannibal encircles this huge army, like bigger than his, like 80, 90,000 troops, like I'm telling you. And they had 3 generals. It was such a large army. And out of the 3 generals, 2 of them were killed, including one of the main ones, which was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He was killed in the battle. And I think about 70,000 of the actual 80, 90,000 of the actual Roman forces were either killed or captured in the battle. I want to say at least 50,000 may have been killed in the battle. That's how awful the battle was. And so I think they consider the Battle of Cannae to be one of the first major encirclement battles. It's kind of like a double envelopment, but more like an encirclement, where an army encircles another army. You see a lot more in modern times, like World War II, and where they encircle cities and armies and things like that. Hannibal was like one of the first to really do that in warfare, at least in ancient times. So yeah, that battle, really changed the war. It could have anyway. In the end, from there he could have marched on Rome. They believe, which I think I've got a map. I don't know if I have a map showing it here. But here's the death of Paulus. Like I said, he would get killed in the battle. But they think that Hannibal wasn't really able to take Rome because, Rome, remember, it's fortified. You have the so-called Servian wall that kind of, protects it around its main city. They don't think he had enough forces or siege equipment. And so the only thing that Hannibal really could do was march around and control part of the actual Italian countryside, which I think he mostly took the southern part of Italy, which he controlled. I think the largest city he actually captured was the city of Capua, which is located south of Rome. And so the Romans at that point had to change strategies. They couldn't, fight Hannibal, mano a mano, like I was kind of talking about. And so this general came in, Scipio Africanus. They kind of see him as one of the greatest generals really in the Second War, which you see right here. Scipio, of course, prepare for war since you have been unable to endure a peace, kind of a quote from him.
Really, Scipio was really using the tactics of Fabius Maximus, the so-called delayer, as the Romans called him. And so Scipio, what he would do, he would launch attacks into other parts of the Carthaginian world. The idea was to basically target Carthage's supply lines, which were coming from Spain, you see. And so you can see uh, the Roman forces then pushed westward into like the southern part of France and into what would be now Spain today. And so that took a matter of like something like 3 or 4 years for the Romans to do that. And eventually they would seize Spain by about 206 BC through several battles you can see there. So I think initially they thought that that would actually force Hannibal to leave Italy, go back to, I guess, Spain or go back to maybe North Africa, but he didn't do that at that point. And so the other thing that Scipio also did, if you know, he launched an attack into then North Africa is the next thing they did as well. I think this image, this map here kind of shows you what they would do. Think around, I want to say 203 BC, I believe is it. The Romans launched an attack from Sicily into North Africa, which will be really the pivotal event, really that ends the war at that point, by the way. Scipio, by the way, is considered to be one of really Rome's greatest generals. I think up there with Gaius Marius and Julius Caesar. So he's really considered a great general overall. Africanus, more like a title they gave him later because he conquered part of Africa or defeated the Carthaginians in Africa. I think his first name was actually Cornelius Scipio. They later gave him the title Africanus. And I think sometimes he was called the Roman Hannibal because people kind of viewed him as being kind of equal to Hannibal in success militarily. So that's what happens. You get this deal where Hannibal and Scipio face off against each other in battle because Hannibal at that point is forced to return to North Africa in 202 BC. That'll lead to a famous battle between those two famous geniuses. You got the so-called Battle of Zama, it's called, which takes place in North Africa. I think the date of it happened in about October 202 BC, October 19th, maybe when it may have happened. And it's fought in now what we call modern Tunisia today. I think the actual battle site is kind of located maybe southwest of the city of Tunis now in Tunisia. And the battle's famous for several things. It's kind of well known. I'll kind of talk about, but there's a deal where supposedly the two generals met each other before the battle. So I think Hannibal was curious about Scipio, and then I think Scipio thought that Hannibal ought to surrender because he thought the war was over. I think the Romans had more forces in Carthage now than the Carthaginians had. And so there was a deal where the two actually met each other, and Hannibal refused to surrender his forces. So they ended up fighting the battle and all that. And of course, what ended up happening, if you know about it, was Scipio's forces would rout Hannibal, like badly beat his forces. And a lot of what played a major role in it was cavalry. The Romans had better cavalry by that time. You can see their cavalry size too in that image right there. 9,000 cavalry, which I think there was a deal where some of the cavalry of Hannibal, which I think were Numidians, switched to the Roman side, and so he was outnumbered. And then Hannibal tried to use war elephants in the battle against the Romans, but they proved to be obsolete because that's one thing you see later after the Battle of Zama. Basically, elephants aren't used much in warfare in the West anymore. They become totally obsolete. But most of Hannibal's forces was either captured or killed or wounded in the battle. So totally, his forces got totally wiped out after that. And so that was pretty much the end of the war for the Carthaginians. The Romans didn't really conquer that area or destroy Carthage. They, of course, do that later in the Third Punic War. But Carthage had to pay actually heavy war reparations for damages that were done to Italy and the Romans. So I think they paid like around 50 years it took them to pay it back. Also, that area of Spain I told you about, the Romans basically seized it and took it after the war. And so the Carthage ends up with very little territory afterwards. And then Hannibal is forced into exile, is something that does happen after the war. You actually flee to the east, where he actually fought for the Seleucid Empire, believe it or not, against the Romans, because the Romans are conquering eastward as they're conquering Carthage as well. In fact, this map kind of shows you kind of the result of the Second Punic War, but that area, that purple on the bottom, Numidia, which is kind of to the west of Carthage, actually got control of that area right there. And so Carthage had very little territory left. It's basically where Tunisia is today. That's all they had left. And you can see the Romans are expanding, take over Spain, and then also take over Greece and Macedonia as well. So it's slowly starting to be a larger state that's going to become an empire eventually. Now, they do have, of course, the Third Punic War, which this war was more decisive that they would have in the end. The Third Punic War, if you know much about it, the Romans are going to eventually destroy Carthage. It's going to be totally obliterated in this war. The actual years of it are from 149 to 146 BC, and they think the reason why the war broke out was different reasons. One was the fact that the Romans feared that Carthage might come back again, like they did with the Second War, because there was kind of a resurgence with Hannibal in the Second War. So the Romans, I think, saw this Third War as like a preemptive type war to prevent them from maybe attacking Rome again. Also, some of the Romans, especially the wealthy people, wanted to take over North Africa, like take it and colonize it, all the land. So they saw that as an opportunity. And what caused them to actually do it, if you know about this, is the fact that Carthage wanted to go to war with Numidia. And so Numidia was kind of like an ally of Rome. And so they used it as a pretext to attack Carthage, which they did. Oh, and by the way, it kind of shows this image right here. The Roman Senate was part of the reason for it. They were the ones pretty much that favored the war, because a lot of the wealthy patricians, they saw this as an opportunity to seize the land that was, of course, in North Africa. And there was this famous Roman senator named Marcus Cato. He's well known during this war, the Third Punic War, as being a major supporter of the third war, and he was very famous for this quote he was known for in the Third Punic War, which was "Carthage must be destroyed," which he would make in various speeches in the Roman Senate. And so he's like one of these several war hawks that was basically involved in supporting the war. You want the Latin, of course, which is Carthago delenda est. And a little poetry there, right? Roses are red, the legions deployed, Carthage must be destroyed. But anyway, yeah, so they would launch this attack into Carthage at that point. And so easily the Romans took most of the territory around Carthage except for the actual city. The city itself barricaded itself inside Carthage. And so the Romans had to basically lay waste to it. They attacked the city and pretty much attacked it house by house, going through the whole thing. And there was a general that did sack the city. His name was Scipio Aemilianus. He's the main general that's really responsible for the sacking of Carthage, which I think happened in the spring of 146 BC. And as they took each part of Carthage, they burned it as they went, the Romans. Yeah, other images kind of showing here of Carthage, of course, being attacked by the Romans. It's kind of like Troy, Troy being destroyed. If you remember correctly, in like the story of the Iliad and Homer, and not much left of it. Like we go to where Tunis, where Tunis is. That's where the ruins of now Carthage is today. There's not much left of it except burned out buildings that are now there. And according to like authors like Polybius, I think who's one of the main historians on the Third Punic War, the city had like maybe 600,000 people, and like 90% of the population was actually killed in the actual sack of Carthage in 146. I think only 50,000 people actually survived, and most of them were actually enslaved, they think, afterwards. So not much left of it. Here's other images kind of showing you, of course, the ruins of Carthage. Of course, there's modern Tunis, of course, in the background right there. Here's other images, of course, right here. But here's an aerial view to kind of give you an idea of what's left of it. So, yeah, most of it was like totally destroyed afterwards. And there's a legend you may have heard of that the Romans took salt. They sowed salt over the place so that nothing would grow there. They think that's a kind of a myth about Carthage that may have been more related to like modern times. And so I want to say maybe 19th century, I think historians start talking about that idea or something like that. But that's never been proven that actually happened, because after Carthage was destroyed, the Romans rebuilt a new Carthage nearby, which is now where Tunis is now, Tunis, Tunisia. So yeah, not much left of it. So totally wiped out in their culture. And so that's one thing about war, the spoils of war. Whoever wins writes the history of it. And so that's why all the different writers that write about pretty much the Punic Wars are all Roman or pro-Roman. Here's kind of a map showing you, but basically after the Punic Wars, end, you can see that's all the territory that the Romans have control of. And so, yeah, they got most of like the southern part of Europe, Spain, southern France, Italy, Greece, Macedonia. They're even getting into part of Western Turkey and starting to take over North Africa at that point. And the Romans, the Republic at that time, which is, becoming an empire, they start calling the Mediterranean Sea. They give it nicknames like Mare Nostrum, which means our sea, or another nickname is Mare Internum, which means internal sea as well. And so I think they joke later that's kind of like a Roman lake, because the fact that for many centuries the Romans control the area around the Mediterranean Sea where their navies dominate, I think up to like the 4th, 5th century CE. The Romans have some kind of control over that whole region. Now I'm going to get next. I'm going to talk about what happens to the Republic, because it goes through a crisis period where the Republic is eventually going to become an empire, controlled by emperors. The traditional Republic will be pretty much destroyed at that point. And I'll kind of first talk about when this happened. They think this happened sometime between the 2nd and the 1st centuries BC. The traditional republic declined, and it becomes this imperial state where these emperors are kind of like autocrats. They're like basically like a monarch that they have. And there's a lot of causes of why the republic declined and became more of an empire. I'll kind of go through this right here. But part of it you see on the right is that obviously conquest and expansion had a lot to do with it. That's one of them right here that you have. So yeah, you got that issue as well that we talked about. Also, failure of land reforms, which is something they tried to do after the Punic Wars. That failed too as well. The rise of slavery, something you see throughout the Roman Empire, where they formed these huge plantations throughout the Roman world, which were mostly controlled by the wealthy. Then you've got the rise of all these Roman dictators that take over Rome as well, like, Julius Caesar, Gaius Marius, Cornelius Sulla, Octavian, Mark Antony, etc. And it actually leads to several civil wars. And civil wars in the end It's one of the things that kind of destroy the traditional republic. Then you've got the rise of the Roman armies, which become more and more powerful in the Roman world that practically control everything politically, even the emperors later. So yeah, there's your kind of that map again, of course, showing the expansion of it, which a lot of it had to do with the Roman armies that are starting to form and become bigger and bigger and more stronger. I wanted to talk about some reforms that they did have that they tried, of course, in the Roman world at that time, which was more like late second century. There was this deal where the Gracchi brothers came in, who were actually plebes, who tried to make reforms. And the Gracchi brothers are called Tiberius and Gaius. Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus, they're usually called. And they would actually attempt land reforms. And what they thought that should happen after the Punic Wars is that all the land should be given to like the lower classes, like the plebes, and also the veterans that fought in the war, like the wars themselves. They thought they should be rewarded for that and all that. However, what happened was the patricians would oppose that. They didn't want that to happen. Both of them eventually, if you know that, were pretty much practically killed off, or they were forced to commit suicide. So that's not what happened. So what ends up happening is that the wealthy, patricians would concentrate all the land into huge plantations that were called latifundia. That's what they called them. And these are these huge slave plantations where mostly they would grow like crops for export, which I think most of the crops they grew were like grain crops, like barley, wheat, and things like that. Also grow like grapes to make wine, olives to make olive oil. They would do a lot of exporting with that to make a lot of money, of course, off of using slave labor, which they got from a lot of these wars that they're fighting in. So the reforms of the Gracchi brothers, didn't come to fruition, and so that didn't help. Then you have the rise of these Roman generals and statesmen that kind of come to power that really lead to why Rome becomes more like an empire later with emperors. So you get these political dictators, if you want to call them, that kind of rise to power because you have these Roman statesmen that are Roman senators and they have their own armies. And so that helps to cause the collapse of the traditional republic by the end of the first century BC. That one on the right, that general on the right you're looking at, of course, in statesman, which is Gaius Marius. He's really considered to be one of the first that really put the republic on that footing of decline, they believe. And Marius was known for a bunch of things. The big thing he was very famous for, he's like, I think, if you know about him, he held the position of Roman consul the most, like 7 times, which I think was a record back then. And then also the other thing about Marius that's real well known, he was also famous for developing what they call the Marian reforms. And that was where he took the Roman army and they began to make it more professionalized. Like the traditional armies that would be later under Julius Caesar in the Roman Empire, he would actually create a lot of reforms to it. And some of the things that he did, which was very famous, was he started to change the requirements of soldiers that enter into the Roman army. And it became mostly the poorer peoples that they brought in. Because if you know about before that, if you went back to the Punic Wars, traditionally you had to have so much wealth, even maybe own some kind of land or some kind of property to actually be in the military. But they basically abolished those requirements. You didn't have to own any property or any wealth. And so most of the people that would join would be the lower classes would go into the army. And that's kind of a bad thing, actually, because a lot of these soldiers would be more loyal to the general than to the state. So that's something you're going to see later. Also, you could also get citizenship, like if you're a foreigner. And also, they would give also soldiers land, too, like if they join the military as well. He's also known for introducing what they call the Standard Legion of the Republic at the time, which has about 4,800 men in it, roughly, soldiers or legionnaires. And it's called the Cohort Legion, which the Cohort Legion was a type of legion which had equipped with about 480 legionnaires or soldiers, and there were about 10 cohorts in a legion, so 4,800 men. Over time, it would expand, by the way. You get up to like the Roman Empire, it gets to like 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers are actually in a legion. And don't forget, you have also men that are non-combatants that also don't fight as well. So that's part of why the Legion was really larger than 4,800 men anyway. But also, don't forget, they would take a cohort of 480 men and they would divide it into what they call centuries. A century is basically a military unit of 80 soldiers. 80 soldiers times six centuries is basically a cohort. And so that was the main military unit that was part of a Roman legion. That was pretty important. Centurion, you may have heard of before, probably mentioned the Bible, is a type of Roman officer that would lead a century, basically. And so I guess if you do the math on it with that, there's 60 centuries in a legion. So anyway, this is kind of about the story about Marius. And Marius was probably one of the best generals, they think, after the Punic Wars at that time. Now, the only thing was, of course, there's an image of the Roman legion. By the way, kind of show you an image of the Roman legion real quick here. But the Romans were heavily armed. You can see they used kind of more of a rectangular type shield to protect themselves in battle. They had more superior armor, compared to, like we saw with the Greek hoplites. So scale armor, later chain mail also being used. They used like a heavy javelin as a weapon as well. Then, of course, the most famous sword that the Romans used was the Roman short sword, which, of course, is called a gladius. Now, of course, we have Cornelius Sulla, of course, another famous Roman general and statesman that'll come next. He was a rival to Marius, who kind of comes in at that point. Oh, by the way, I didn't show that part right there in the image right there. But one thing about Marius I forgot to talk about that I did want to mention, I don't think that's in there about that. At the top, you see there it is, the Aquila. Forgot about that, mentioned about that. But the so-called eagle symbol, that became basically the symbol of all legions after that. So Marius and Sulla, all these other generals that come later, all their legions will use that as the actual symbol of all legions, which the eagle was connected to the god Jupiter and all that. But back to basically talking about Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was this younger general and statesman who challenged Marius for control of Rome. And if you know about the two, would end up eventually getting into loggerheads with each other. And part of the problem in Rome at the time was that they had these two different political factions that formed. You had the so-called Populares on one side, and you had the Optimates. What was the difference? The Populares were these senators that supported mostly patrician and wealthy ideas, protect, the wealthy people's property and things like that, support their ideas. And then the Optimates, actually, I'm sorry, I got that backwards, excuse me, for some reason. Populares, were actually the supporters of plebes. Get that backwards, I don't know why. The Populares were for plebes and their supporters, like Gaius Marius, Julius Caesar, were kind of like Populares men. And then Optimates, were the senators that were more for the wealthy people. I don't know why I got that backwards for some reason. But so that's kind of what caused them to go to loggerheads. They also think that was part of the reason why the Republic collapsed later into a traditional empire we see later, because these two sides opposing each other. So it would actually lead to a civil war where Sulla declared war on Marius' supporters and him. And it would drag on for several years, but they think that had a major role in causing the decline of the traditional republic because um, several civil wars will kind of break out after that because of this incident. They think one thing that Marius is very famous for. Marius would eventually, we'll see the rise of Julius Caesar afterwards with him, but with the Optimates and the Populares at war with each other, um, one thing that you do see that's very famous about Sulla is going to revive the dictatorship in Rome, which they'd had it before, but had only been used really in times of emergency. And so, one thing that Sulla was very famous for is that he would march on Rome. It's one of the things that he would do and restore the actual Roman dictatorship between about 82 to 79 BC. So they think that kind of plays a role later in why you get the rise of Julius Caesar, the idea of this dictatorship and all that. But the only thing about Sulla was he stepped out, was one of the things that, of course, would happen. But yeah, the Optimates and the Populares, Populares more support of plebes, Optimates in support of like patricians and the wealthy, that basically is a major conflict in later causing the downfall, of course, of the Republic. Now, like I said about Julius Caesar, that's really considered to be one of the main events that really leads to why the traditional Republic declines at that point. And if you know about this time after the period of Marius and Sulla, you get this deal where they have these triumvirates that come in. I'll get to this that forms around 60 BC. Then there's another one later. We'll talk about the second triumvirate that forms in 43 BC. Those two things really, it's kind of the major events that really lead to why the Republic, eventually the traditional Republic ends. And the first triumvirate was this alliance that formed between Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Gnaeus Pompey, sometimes called Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. And kind of seen as almost like a dictatorship at this point forming to control a lot of the policies of Rome. And here's kind of an image of course, the three right there, Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. On the left, Caesar was more of this pro-populares man. He was in the Senate. He favored more of like the plebes and their causes. And Caesar later is known for being a great general, like considered one of the greatest generals in probably Roman history, up there with Scipio, Marius, and others. And so he kind of, like I said, is going to play a major role in why the traditional republic, the demise of it, will become, of course. Then the man in the middle, which is Marcus Crassus, he was more of a he was more pro-optimate, basically type senator. And he was famous for his military exploits as well. Crassus actually was considered to be one of the most wealthy men in Rome. I think he was kind of considered almost like a billionaire. And then Pompey on the right, Gnaeus Pompey, of course, who's also called Pompey the Great. I think he's got another nickname, which is the Kid Butcher. I think they called him sometimes as well. He was a great general too, a great statesman of Rome. And I'll get to it in a second. He actually forms an alliance with Caesar, including marrying his daughter, the daughter of Caesar. And so Gnaeus Pompey was the son-in-law of Julius Caesar. So I think I've got some images right here showing it. So yeah, you can see the first triumvirate lasted from about 60 BC to 53 BC. So yeah, I got more about him right there. So Caesar, very popular, especially with the lower classes. Great legal mind too, Caesar. He was also a writer, wrote a few historical works in the first century BC, more known for being a great Roman general in his conquests. Crassus, more known for his wealth and influence in the Roman state. Yeah, he did come from the equestrian order, which I told you was kind of that upper middle class type social class that was that came out of, I guess, originally the cavalry. Maybe they think Pompey was also had a lot of wealth and also had a military reputation that was kind of equal to Caesar and Crassus as well. There's Julius Caesar, of course, right there on the left. He's going to be known for a lot of his conquests. I'll get to the Gallic Wars later. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about how he practically takes over the whole republic by about 45, 44 BC as well. By the way, Caesar, a little bit about him. Part of why he was able to rise to power was because he was actually a nephew of Gaius Marius, I think by marriage. And so that kind of gave him a lot of political connections in Rome. But I think when Sulla took over, he actually had to flee Rome for a while, which he did. There's Marcus Crassus right there. Now, I'll kind of talk about one thing that Marcus Crassus is famous for with Pompey. If you know about this story, those two men became real popular because of the Spartacus revolt that broke out around 73 BC. 73 to 71 BC is about when it happened. Anyway, it's called different names. They sometimes call it the Third Servile War. And the Spartacus revolt was this revolt that broke out in Italy among gladiators and slaves. And it was led by this gladiator who I think I've got an image of. I've got different images right here, of course, of the Spartacus Rebellion, they call it also as well. But yeah, Spartacus, of course, Kirk Douglas, later, of course, the famous movie about Spartacus in 1960, which I think was one of Stanley Kubrick's first movie he made. But they think that Spartacus was some kind of Thracian soldier who came from like where northern Greece is today, and he was being trained as a gladiator, and so he rebelled against the Romans, and he formed these slave armies that fought against the Romans, which he was actually successful. Actually defeated several Roman armies for a while, short time. But they do think that the Spartacus revolt, that rebellion, was one of the bloodiest in the Roman Republic. I think I want to say something like 60,000 people were probably killed on both sides combined. And if you know about what happened, because of mostly Crassus and Pompey, they were able to defeat Spartacus' forces. And most of the men, like what happened, like the ones that I guess survived from the revolt, were actually crucified. They were actually crucified along the Appian Way, which is a main roadway that runs from Rome to where Capel is down in Naples. And they were crucified along the road, which they're not sure what happened to Spartacus. I think they theorize that Spartacus died in battle against the Romans. I know in the movie Spartacus, he basically is actually crucified, but they're not sure if that really happened or not that way. So that's kind of considered a very famous event. But it made, like I said, Crassus and Pompey kind of famous because they finished it off. So yeah, I'll kind of get in next. The other thing that, of course, is real famous about, of course, Julius Caesar is the Gallic Wars. They think that actual campaign is really what makes Caesar kind of famous in the Roman world at the time. It was a war that lasted 7 or 8 years in Gaul, which Gaul is basically called mostly France today, and part of Belgium is where it is. But it's really considered to be one of his best conquests. He's kind of known for Julius Caesar, so-called Gallic Wars. And kind of show an image right here, but there's basically mostly where the Romans fought, of course, in what we call Gaul. So Caesar was given kind of control of that area to try to control and conquer. And so the actual wars were fought against these Gallic tribes that rebelled against the Romans, and they were led by this I think it was like a Gaelic or German type general or king that was named Vercingetorix. And he kind of tried to organize all the tribes to fight against the Romans. I think that's kind of an image of him right 2 BC is when it was. And that's when they actually defeated and captured Vercingetorix, who was later brought back to Rome, I think, where he was eventually killed by the Romans. But they do think that the conflict itself was pretty bloody. Like between 1 to 2 million were probably killed and enslaved in the actual Gallic Wars. And so it's part of why Caesar becomes so famous and so wealthy afterwards because of that actual conquest right there. So there's Vercingetorix statue of him on the right. If we go back to that map right there, another thing that Caesar did that's really famous, he also invaded into what is Germany. They think between about maybe what would be, I want to say, yeah, I've got 55 to 54 BC. He would actually invade into Britain, and then he also invaded into Germany. So he did both these events. That's kind of famous. Where Koblenz is, which is up on the Rhine River, now in Western Germany, there's actually this deal where he actually built a bridge. Actually, it might have been about 2 bridges at one point across the actual Rhine River. He actually crosses with his forces into Germany after some of the different Gauls that went into Germany and all that. So he went there and did that. And then, of course, he also invaded into Britain twice also as well. So that's pretty amazing. Caesar was one of the first to actually Roman to go into Germany and also to attack into Britain. But the Romans were never successful in conquering that area of Germany, or what they call Germania is what they called it. But later the Romans will conquer most of Britain except for the northern part of Scotland. Now, the other thing that happened too, I'll kind of get into this next, that the actual triumvirate would break up. Oh, by the way, I didn't kind of mention this, kind of go back, and I forgot to talk about this image. If you go back to what I was talking about, yeah, Caesar also wrote about the wars. By the way, I forgot to talk about that. The series of books he wrote, which are called the commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which were written in 8 books. It's kind of like a first-hand account of the actual campaigns, which I think he wrote book by book, which he published in Rome, each one, I guess, over each season. And it made him real popular in Rome because we were reading about his conquests and all that. And so kind of written in a third person too by Caesar. And so, yeah, Caesar was kind of this writer who wrote some histories like about the Gallic Wars. And he has another book called The Civil War, which is about his war with his son-in-law Pompey, which they think helps end the actual traditional republic. But they're not sure if he wrote it or not. I think there's a theory that the second book, The Civil War, was maybe ghost written by somebody, but they're not sure about that. So yeah, that's the next thing, like I said, that'll happen, of course, is that Caesar and Pompey are going to eventually fight it out for, of course, control of Rome. Part of what happened was in 53 BC, Crassus was kind of jealous of what Caesar was doing in Gaul. And so he decided to attack the Parthian Empire. And if you know what happened, he got killed fighting against the Parthians. They captured him in 53 BC at the Battle of, it's called Carrhae, I think it's called usually. And he was captured and executed afterwards. And so that caused the first triumvirate to collapse at that point. And so now you only had 2 men left, Julius Caesar and Pompey, that were in this original pact that they had. And so the 2 are going to come to loggerheads. By the way, a little about Pompey. I thought I had something on Pompey earlier. I thought I had a slide on him somewhere that I had. I think he's right. There he is right there. Pompey right there. Yeah, Pompey was a famous general and statesman too. Originally a protege of Sulla and Crassus as well. Called also the Great. I think there's different theories on why he's called the Kid Butcher, Teenage Butcher, or something like that. But he did kill off a lot of people, maybe because of the Spartacus revolt. Had a bunch of people executed, things like that. But yeah, he's the one that would form this alliance with Caesar and Crassus. And I told you, he's the one that married Julius Caesar's only child, really, they had, of course, which is his daughter Julia. And so, like I said, Gnaeus Pompey, sometimes called Pompey the Great, was basically the son-in-law of Julius Caesar. So yeah, let me get into, and I'll talk about what happens, of course, with these two men. One of the things that happens is that, if I remember correctly, we were talking about the populares and the optimates. Caesar, like I told you, was a populares man that supported more the plebes. Pompey was too, originally. I think he kind of supported the plebes and all that and their causes. But apparently, what happened was Pompey decided to switch to more the senatorial side of the optimates, and so he kind of supported them against Caesar, and so you end up with this deal where the two fight for control of the Republic, the so-called, they call it Caesar's Civil War, I think is usually what they nickname it. It's got different names, but a lot of people kind of view this as the second major civil war that breaks out in the second century. And they do think it's one of the major reasons for why the traditional republic will eventually decline and be replaced by the empire because of the aftermaths that happen after that particular conflict. Now, if you know the story about this, Caesar's still in Gaul with his forces. And so Caesar decides to march towards Italy because he doesn't like what Pompey's doing, of course, in Rome with the Senate. And so he marches to what that river is right there. You can see, by the way, in northern Italy, which is called the Rubicon. The Rubicon, by the way, was kind of like the border between Gaul in Italy. And Pompey had like control of Italy with his forces. And then you had Caesar in the north, of course, in Gaul, northern Italy. And so Caesar, in January, they think of 49 BC, crosses the Rubicon, and they think that's the actual event that causes the outbreak of this civil war. Caesar's famous for the quote we heard of, which is the die is cast, or the common quote in Latin is alea jacta est. Of course, here's the actual quote in English, of course, right there. What does he mean by that? The die is cast, or the die has been cast. It's got different translations of it. Basically, he means that he's gambling, by marching into Italy with his forces. And I guess he realizes if he fails, he's dead. But if he succeeds, he probably would take over Rome and be the one in control. And so he's gambling. And Caesar was a gambling man. He liked to play dice and things like that. And so I guess he used die as an example to show, what his chances were against this war against his son-in-law, Pompey. So basically, you can see that's the campaigns of Julius Caesar, which, of course, in this second campaign, of course, in the Civil War, is going to go on to conquer most of the Roman Republic. And apparently, Pompey, realizing that he doesn't really have enough forces to fight Caesar, who's got more crack forces, actually fled to Greece at that point. And kind of show this. They have a battle they fight in 48 BC, which was really kind of considered the most pivotal battle really fought in Caesar's Civil War. Caesar, who has not as many forces, part of why Pompey went to Greece was to get more soldiers to fight against Julius Caesar. And at that point, Caesar's trying to take over Rome. But in August of 48 BC, they fight in Greece, Western Greece, the Battle of Pharsalus, which was fought on August the 9th, 48 BC. And Caesar's forces, by the way, they were outnumbered. Caesar had about 25,000 troops, and Pompey had 50,000. Actually, had about outnumbered 2-1. But Caesar's forces were just crack forces that had been fighting in Gaul for years. They just crushed Pompey's forces, and half of them didn't want to fight. They surrendered, basically, to Caesar's forces. And so what happened was it forced Pompey to flee. He had to flee to basically what is Ptolemaic Egypt. And so he was trying to seek refuge from the Egyptians, from the Romans. And when he got to Egypt, the Egyptians under King Ptolemy the fourth. Actually, I think it's that's actually a typo there. I just realized it right there. But Ptolemy, I think it's the 13th was the actual ruler at the time. I think 14 is the brother of. They have a 14 who's the brother of Ptolemy, but Ptolemy the 13th would have him assassinated because he feared that the Romans might come in and conquer Egypt and add to the republic. And so he realized he had to do something, and so he killed Pompey at that point. Then what happened next? Caesar then entered Egypt, and he kind of forms this alliance with basically what is Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra. And of course, Cleopatra, by the way, at the time was actually co-ruling with her brother Ptolemy the 13th, who really didn't want her to reign, by the way. And so they end up in a civil war with each other. And Caesar helps Cleopatra get her throne, like control Egypt, sole ruler after that. And Ptolemy was killed afterwards. And I think afterwards they had Ptolemy the 14th, who was another brother of the Ptolemies, became the ruler afterwards with Cleopatra kind of married her. It's kind of weird, but Cleopatra actually married both her brothers, which is kind of the Egyptian tradition, about that. But about it, Caesar and one thing that's very famous about Cleopatra and Caesar, they became lovers. So Cleopatra was kind of like his mistress for a bunch of years until assassination, and they actually would have one son together who was called Caesarion. I think they dubbed him. I think is what they called him or something like that. And so basically, that's basically what that would be. Actually, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Ptolemy the 14th, I think, is not a brother. That's actually, I think that's a nephew. Yeah, nephew of actually Ptolemy the 13th is what it is. So got that wrong. But anyway, let me talk about this map right here, though. But you can kind of see that extent of like Caesar's conquests. By the way, you can see that Julius Caesar conquers pretty much most of the area where the Romans are going to control the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see took over Spain, besides Gaul, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Syria, North Africa. All those areas are going to be basically taken by Caesar in these wars against Pompey and his supporters. And Caesar actually summed it up in a famous quote you may have heard of called Veni Vidi Vici, which means I came, I saw, I conquered. Anyway, that quote kind of sums up, basically how easy the campaigns were of Julius Caesar. And it was actually written in a letter to the Roman Senate describing his conquests in general. So he all did this, by the way, at an age that was closer to like maybe 50 or so when he started all these conquests. So he was much older, compared to like maybe Alexander the Great, who was like in his 20s. What happened though afterwards? One thing that occurs, if because he conquers all of basically the republic at that point. The Senate declares him a dictator of Rome, which I think at first in 40, I think it's 45 BC, he was declared dictator for like 10 years, and then in 44 BC they decided to make it for life. And so that really angered a lot of the optimates in the Roman Senate that didn't like what Julius Caesar was doing. They thought he was going to destroy the traditional republic. There was even fear that Caesar was going to become a king. You can start talking about the idea of having a rex and all of that. And so that led to a famous conspiracy that formed to kill Caesar, which was, they call it the Liberators conspiracy. And this was like a ring of senators that were kind of more backers of like Pompey, his supporters. Some that even had been friends with Julius Caesar as well. And so they plotted to kill Julius Caesar in March of 44 BC March 15th, is the famous date when the assassination of Julius Caesar happens. They call it the Ides of March, which the Ides of March, by the way, or just Ides, means middle of March, because in the Roman calendar, they usually had a middle date, which is the 15th. That's one thing about Caesar. He's very famous for reforms to Rome, which included like the so-called Julian calendar, which was actually one of the first leap calendars that was developed in the world. They think it may have been influenced from maybe Egyptian ideas. Yeah, that's a very famous painting, by the way, which I think I want to say was done in I want to say the 1800s. Vincenzo Camuccini, I think is his name. He actually made this painting called The Death of Caesar, which shows the actual, deal where the actual senators attack Julius Caesar. I'll kind of talk a little bit about it, but the actual assassination didn't happen in the actual Senate. It happened in what they call the Theater of Pompey, which was this theater that Gnaeus Pompey had built in Rome in the Forum, and they would often meet there. And anyway, he was going into the annex of the actual Theater of Pompey, where a bunch of these senators approached him. They were part of the conspiracy. I think they approached him with some kind of petition to sign at that point. And as Caesar tried to walk away, they grabbed his toga and wouldn't let go of him. Let go of him. And Caesar said, "This is violence," or something like that. And they started stabbing him. And they think Caesar was stabbed maybe 23 times by the actual conspirators. And the two most famous conspirators that were part of the liberators was Gaius Cassius Longinus and then Marcus Brutus, who, by the way, was an ancestor of the original Brutus, they think, that went back to the founding of actual Rome. I think I've got an image showing the actual two right here. So you got Marcus Brutus on the left there in that image. And then the other they call usually Cassius, I think call him for short, usually Gaius Cassius Longinus. So those two are actually sort of two of the main ones that were kind of involved in the actual conspiracy. They say Brutus was the one that stabbed, of course, the last one to stab Caesar. Of course, they say that Caesar supposedly said to Brutus, "Et tu, Brute," and you, Brutus. They say like a question, but they're not sure he really said that or not. That's more like Shakespeare, because Shakespeare later, made a play, of course, called Julius Caesar. But there's a debate about what he said, at the end when he got stabbed. I think there's even another theory that he said, "You too, my son," or something like that as well. But what ends up happening, the death of Caesar, you can see the aftermath of it. His body right there is kind of laying on the floor of the, I guess where that theater is I'm talking about, Theater Pompey. And so it just creates chaos in Rome. They have, of course, a funeral afterwards of Caesar. And I'll get to Mark Antony later, but Mark Antony, who was one of the generals of Julius Caesar, he gives a great eulogy at Caesar's funeral. I think they cremated the body afterwards, which Romans traditionally did. But they think that what's going to happen afterwards, of course, is that it's going to create civil war. Chaos in Rome. I think they burned down part of Rome after Caesar is killed. I'll get to Octavian. We're going to talk about Octavian there. Octavian's going to come in. He's a nephew of Julius Caesar, and he's going to take control of the Republic. He's going to turn it into, of course, the Roman Empire that we know of course, later. He, of course, is more known by another name you may have heard of called Caesar Augustus, and he'll become the first Roman emperor. So I'll kind of get to that later, talk about the Roman Empire, which I think I'll probably have the Roman Empire, and at least probably going to take me a 3-part series on that later to probably wrap it up.